Okay, I think we can probably get started now and let people come in as we do. But of course, what an absolute pleasure it is to really be having this conversation today. And firstly, want to say thank you to everyone for joining the call and taking the time out of their busy days. I think the support and the interest that we have had for this webinar is really exciting for myself, but I think is really an indication of where the market is going with regards to sustainability and other topics of this nature. So firstly, I'm going to quickly introduce myself and Avarni, and then I'll pass it over to Kristina and Cornell. So Avarni is a AI-based carbon management technology that specializes in the management of those scope 3 or those supply chain emissions. And we really work with those leading enterprise organizations across the globe, such as the City of London, and enable them to really more effectively manage and tackle their very ambitious scope 3 or the supply chain targets. So on that note, and of course, to introduce myself, the head of customer success here at Avarni, and that gives me the very exciting opportunity to work with some great organizations, work with some great people, and really understand our enterprises' challenges, their opportunities in more detail, and really hopefully accelerate their journey to net zero. But on that note, I'll pass it over to Kristina and Cornell, and then we'll jump into sort of why are we here today.
Thank you, David. So yeah, hello everybody. It's great to see so many of you on the call, both names I recognize and names I don't. So I'm Kristina, and I'm the Sustainable Supply Chain Manager at the City of London Corporation, which is the governing body to the Square Mile. And I will hand over to Cornell.
Morning, everybody. I'm Cornell Campbell, Director of Sales for EMEA for Avarni. I've recently joined a couple of months ago. I've been in sustainability for 15 years, originally from the energy sector, and really keen to, have feedback from you guys after this call and catch up to you. You may have seen me snooping around on LinkedIn, so thank you to those who've accepted. This is really about, the best kept secret, I think, personally, and what Avarni excels at with supply chain engagement. So, thank you for joining.
Thanks for that, Kristina and Cornell. Moving on to the next slide. I want to speak about, of course, why we're here. And I think one thing that is very important to Avarni is really learning out in the open. And we want to share this partnership that we do have with the City of London. And we want to talk about some of those challenges that we have faced, the opportunities that we do see, and really share what we believe is a bit of a blueprint for success with regards to managing your supply chain emissions or those scope 3 emissions. To start with a bit of housekeeping, of course, this session is being recorded. You'll receive that link after by email. Please share that around. It'll be on YouTube as well, so enjoy it there. Questions? We've got our great head of marketing, Angela, on the call, who will be helping us with managing the questions. And I want to keep this as an open discussion as possible. So please do drop your questions in the chat, and look forward to having a discussion to the end of the conversation to speak to those. But really want to understand where the market is right now and sort of get a pulse on that. So I think questions are a great way to understand that. Of course, with regards to what is the agenda we'll be speaking today. Firstly, I want to cover really the foundations of emissions and why supply chain emissions right now are fundamentally important. And from there, I want to pass it over to Kristina to really talk to the City of London's journey to net zero and how we've been able to drive a lot of success through the collaboration with suppliers. So on that note, if we move on to the next component or the next slide, please. Thank you. So I think of course, we need to start at the foundations or really the basics of greenhouse gas accounting. And to do that, and to explain why Scope 3 emissions are fundamentally important right now, I'm going to start with a quick couple of definitions on what Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are. I'm sure you've heard these definitions many times, but if you haven't, Scope 1 emissions are those direct emissions that are owned or operated by an organization. So a really two simple examples would be if it is diesel utilized in a manufacturing facility or potentially fuel that goes into an operating fleet of vehicles. Scope 2 emissions is the emissions, those indirect emissions associated with your purchased electricity. So traditionally that is it's all the emissions that are derived from turning on your lights, but increasingly it is being emissions that are derived from electricity to power EV vehicle fleets or things of that nature. And Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are very broad. They are the indirect emissions derived from your broader value chain or supply chain. It is all the components of your upstream and downstream supply chain, inclusive of the goods or services that you procure, the transportation and distribution between suppliers, the emissions associated with your employees, if it's in the form of commuting or business travel, and also emissions associated with your product or your services use, so the use of a sold good or service. And with regards to why it is important and why emissions have been created in this way, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the carbon accounting standard, created the scopes in this way in that it creates a level of shared accountability between organizations to drive and accelerate action, in the sense that one organization's Scope 3 emissions, or the City of London's Scope 3 emissions, is their suppliers' Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So it creates this level of accountability to drive action and collaboration together. And of course, why this is important, I think putting it right in the center of the screen, but it's really a function or a problem of scale. And on average or generally, Scope 3 emissions represent 11 times the magnitude of those direct emissions or those Scope 1 emissions. So it is the big part of the problem. As an example, Apple, as what we all know, Apple, their Scope 3 emissions represents 99% plus of their broad inventory. So when they say they're carbon neutral for Scope 1 and 2, we should say you should do more. So that's why Scope 3 emissions is fundamentally important. So now that we have sort of that broad foundation, I want to move on to the next slide, which is a really good segue into a number of the key trends that we're seeing with regards to supply chains right now and what is on the rise. And firstly, I want to speak to the Science Based Targets Institute. They are a verification organization that verifies organizations' net zero targets. And companies setting science-based targets is growing exponentially. In the year of 2022, we saw the number of companies that were setting these science-based targets was greater than the sum of the past 7 years. So this is, of course, an indication that the market is maturing and sustainability is becoming a very significant business initiative right now. But secondly, I think what this really indicates to myself is that the Science Based Institute is becoming the source of truth for the centralization of verified net zero targets that aids organizations to communicate a target without being at the risk of potential greenwashing. And if we look at broadly dive into these SBT numbers, I think another interesting stat is one, that 58% of the organizations that did set these targets were SMEs. And again, I think this is a function of a maturing market as we see sustainability pressures moving down the chain, initially from regulators, now to large MNCs, and then being pushed down supply chains across to SMEs. The second trend that we're seeing is that with regards to collaboration. And collaboration is an indication to success, and the ways in which we see collaboration and how we can drive success through collaboration is one, through industry partners, and secondly, across your supply chain. So with regards to industries is that, of course, we see within industries, organizations will have a shared value chain. So we need to capitalize this and make it easy for value chains to be able to decarbonize and evolve to a net zero economy. And to do that, it is about setting standards with regards to sustainability, procurement across industries, sharing educational content and building programs together, and acting as collaborators rather than adversaries and blockers. I think a really great industry which is doing this right now is the pharmaceuticals industry. And they have the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Institute, which is doing great work with regards to the top 15 to 20 pharmaceutical companies that are driving procurement success in regards to sustainability together. And of course, Scope 3 emissions are supply chain emissions, and we need to collaborate and drive value to our supply chains to be able to tackle this problem. So it's about working with our supply chains. It's about providing capabilities, which I'll speak to in a bit later. But that has been a really key driver of our success, I believe, that we've had with the City of London. And then thirdly, of course, I think we're seeing increasing amounts of external pressures. And I think that there's stakeholder pressures in the form of course, we're seeing in the form of procurement pressures. So organizations, procurement teams, putting pressure on organizations with regard to sustainability. Initially, we see pressures coming from investors required to manage their own financed emissions or their own Scope 3 emissions, and that is putting pressure on the larger group of organizations. And then increasingly, we're seeing more regulation with regards to Scope 3 emissions or their supply chain emissions. And I think more recently, that would be California's landmark bill that is mandating that companies over $1 billion in revenue are required to not only report their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but report their Scope 3 emissions. We believe this is what the future of regulation and are confident in what the future of regulation will look like in the next couple of years. And I think it is an indication and a signal to the market that organizations need to be better prepared and looking to manage their Scope 3 emissions now before these regulations do come into place. So we'll move it on to the next slide. And so we have these broad trends of saying that Scope 3 emissions and supply chain emissions are driving or are required right now. But what are the key learnings that we've been able to take from working with our supply chains broadly across the globe? And I think, firstly, although it is cliche, I think we are unable to reduce what we don't measure. So of course, I think firstly, we need to do that initial baseline and understand where our emissions are. But at Avarni, we believe that organizations need to go further and need to begin to, from the very start, measure key sustainability metrics across their organizations. And good metrics to understand your supply chain maturity with regard to sustainability might be, what is the proportion of my supply chain emissions that have an SBTI target? So what is the proportion of my supply chain emissions that have reported to CDP? These metrics are metrics that you'll be able to track over time. They give you insights into where is our supply chain right now, and how can we take actions that are going to achieve these broad goals that we might have in place, which is 2030 and 2050. But of course, they will aid you to set more granular milestones into this decarbonisation journey. Secondly, success, especially across your supply chain, is about embedding it into your policy and delivering those capabilities to your suppliers to help them meet this policy. So policy can really start just by having conversations and education across your organization. And that might start with educating your procurement teams with regards to sustainable procurement, how and what Scope 3 emissions are, and how important it is, and how procurement is really a lever within your organization to drive sustainability, drive change, and drive action across the organization. And then as your organization matures, policy can look to embedding sustainability into supplier renewals, embedding it into success metrics for contracts. These are all policies that we look to begin to integrate when we work with our enterprises. And then, of course, supply chains, they're complex, they have very mature players, and they have also many SMEs that may not lack capabilities in the form of knowledge, in the form of technology capabilities, in the form of processes to meet these requirements. And what we've done, a lot of the work that we've done with the City of London has been thinking about, and Kristina will speak to it further, is how can we make it easy for suppliers? How can we give them the capabilities? And we really, at Avarni, we really think that starts with technology. So Avarni gives your tier 1 suppliers a free instance of the Avarni solution to begin to manage their emissions, calculate their emissions, and to utilize our software to set a target, which is going to drive your Scope 3 strategy as well. And the last component I want to speak to is with regards to just starting somewhere. A lot of the time we see that organizations, if it's at the SME level, trying to apply to a questionnaire or a request from an organization to the enterprises as well, they get fussed on accounting methodologies. And we think it is fundamentally important to start somewhere, start with spend data to begin to baseline those Scope 3 emissions, and then we can mature over time, shifting to that activity data and shifting to the more granular or more robust data from your supply chain. So I think it's about continually improving and working with your suppliers to get their that primary data from your suppliers. But we do need to start somewhere. So I think this is sort of broke down sort of what Scope 3 emissions are and the broader foundations and where the market is going. But I think more importantly, what we really want to discuss today and share, and I'll pass it over to Kristina, is to talk through sort of some of the key learnings and the partnerships that we have had together, and we can start there. So I'll pass it to yourself, Kristina.
Thank you, David. And hopefully, like you said, some of the things I'm going to talk about next will kind of reinforce what you've been saying, and hopefully there's some similarities there so people can kind of see it working in practice. And so if we could move on to the next slide, please. So the city has set some ambitious climate targets back in 2021, and these are to be net zero within its own operations, so Scope 1 and 2 by 2027, and its full value chain, so Scope 3 by 2040. The city is also looking at its boundary emissions and has a target to be net zero within the square mile, where it's the local government, by 2040. As part of this, the city has funded a climate course for SMEs, so small medium enterprises, through the Heart of the City programme. And this offers free resources for everybody, but specifically free kind of support, like one-to-one support for SMEs that are based in the square mile, or those that are directly in the city's supply chain. So that's been really helpful for obviously us trying to get our supply chain to be more carbon ready and looking at reduction. And there, the little QR code with the dinosaur in on the page should take you directly through to that. Purchase goods and services, so that bit of the supply chain, is the third largest carbon group at the corporation behind financial investments and lease assets. So it is critical to meeting our 2040 target. Purchase goods and services, though, is quite a difficult category to kind of monitor. And David alluded to some of the points, but obviously each supplier has its own supply chain that will need to decarbonize in order for it to kind of get to net zero. So you've got one supplier that's backed up by many suppliers, which is backed up by many suppliers as well. So the net zero ambition needs to flow down through the supply chain in order to get to net zero there. There is also a responsibility at the top of the chain, so clients, to kind of show that this is an area worth investing in. Otherwise, there's no incentive for our supplier base to kind of look at opportunity or look at different ways of completing their contract obligations. Using kind of the spend-based proxy method and the emissions factors from DEFRA meant that the more we spent, the higher the carbon emissions we had. So unsurprisingly, carbon went down during COVID and increased the year after, which you can see on the graph there. And the graph will be updated next month for our kind of most recent carbon footprint. This has made it obviously very difficult to take action, as sometimes, at least right now, the more sustainable option might have an initial higher upfront cost, but could yield better energy efficiency or lower carbon, embodied carbon once in place. And it also doesn't recognise some of the good work individual suppliers are doing on this journey, which may have been one of the reasons that they won the tender in the first place, because at least at the city, like, climate action is our number one responsible procurement commitment.
Wait a minute.
Increasingly visible within our procurement process. So that's just kind of a bit of a background to where we started and why we're kind of looking at this. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So in order to meet our 2040 target, we've started working with our supply chain now. As mentioned, there is kind of a bit of a tail to it, and it will take time to upskill the suppliers and for that to cascade down in a meaningful way. We are taking an holistic approach to working in partnership with our supply chain, and that's resulted that we're kind of focusing on 25 of our supply chain right now. And this is really so that we get a cross-section of industries and sizes so that we can get the best learnings out of this in order to kind of go more wide. We wanted to start quite small, really, so it was kind of a bit more manageable. But then the plan is, obviously, as we get closer to 2040, we'll invite and involve more suppliers on the journey. Our 25 does have representation from small, medium and large businesses, as well as the charity sector, and it does cover both goods and services. So last April, we started asking a non-scored question of all suppliers who bid for work over £100,000. And that was just asking if they had a net zero target. So it was non-scored. We didn't mind whether they said yes or no, or even if they answered it. But it was really just to help us to get a sense of where the market was overall. And we did find very positively that people were answering this question, and that in many instances, they either had a kind of target or were working to complete it, which gave us some confidence. Which meant that April this year, we added standard climate action wording into every tender over £100,000. And this was really just to start warming up the market and encouraging both the city and its suppliers to look for more sustainable ways of completing the contract, both from a goods and services point of view. Some of this wording is shown on the central column on the screen. And I'm also collaborating with other London councils through the London Responsible Procurement Network to create some standard wording and standard requests from our suppliers to try and make it easier for suppliers who work across the different authorities to kind of give the same information in the same format. And it's pleasing to see some of those councils on the call today. Our objectives on the right-hand side are set so that numbers 2 to 4 will support our overarching objective of reducing the amount of carbon emissions that we have within this sector. And I will just highlight that although the second objective references science-based targets, it also has an equivalent featuring in there. And that was just to make sure that the cost of the certification or the time of going through this process wasn't inhibiting any supplier from participating in our tendering process. We're more interested in the activity that they're doing. So how are they kind of creating or working towards net zero, rather than how many pieces of paper they have or how many things that they've signed up to. We are in a very fortunate position that we have a lot of support for our suppliers, both internal within the corporation and external. And some of these are shown on the screen. I really would encourage you all to look at our low carbon procurement guide and document, which is on our external website under responsible procurement, because we really were trying it through this document as a way to upskill people and just try and demystify some of the terms, as well as kind of showing what we think is around this topic and where they might get questions in the future should they go on to bid for some of our work. Between myself, Avarni, and Heart of the City, suppliers have a number of different people to support them and answer any questions that they might have in order to try and create their carbon reduction or carbon footprint in the first instance, and then a carbon reduction plan going forward. Next slide, please. So as kind of alluded to earlier, sustainability does kind of require collaboration, and the box and the flow diagram are broadly similar, but I thought I'd just put them together. Is the box is really what we did for getting the data for financial year 22-23, whereas the stepped approach is what we're kind of aiming towards going forward for financial year 23-24 onwards. The main real difference is just the level of hand-holding and awareness of the program as we move away or move into kind of a BAU space. Pre-Avarni, I had been engaging with suppliers to kind of better understand what data we could get and how we could move away from a spend-based proxy. And one supplier was able to provide us with their own emissions-based factor based on the carbon footprint that they had reported externally on. And another was able to give us granular information based on what we were actually ordering through them. However, although this information was on Excel spreadsheets and, quite small scale, it was only a handful of suppliers. So that meant when we got to kind of the annual reporting part, our auditors weren't really interested. It was going to take a lot of work for them to use that information to override the proxy. And that meant that we remained at 100% proxy for the financial year 21-22 footprint. And also meant that we kind of turned our focus to getting a carbon reporting tool. The theory being that this would kind of capture that information and be a lot easier to override proxy. And then where necessary, we would have all of the information held centrally so that it was ready for audit purposes, and we were able to kind of move away some of our spend from kind of DEFRA emissions factors. This led to a procurement exercise, and Avarni were the winning provider, and obviously we are here today. Together, we met the suppliers and explained kind of the what, the why, the how.
Was going carbon emissions in procurement.
Sorry about that. So the first step of this, after kind of speaking to the suppliers and kind of really saying who Avarni were and what we were doing, was issuing them all with a questionnaire. So this questionnaire was for them to insert either their carbon emissions data if they already had it, or some of the raw data that we could convert to carbon if they hadn't got to that stage so far. The output of this was going to be kind of a specific carbon emissions factor based on that supplier's footprint. So instead of using kind of SIC codes and proxy and DEFRA, it was really looking at what had they measured themselves and kind of rewarding really wherever they were in their journey, with the view being that this was our first step, and then we would move away from that again towards more contract specific emissions. We had hoped that obviously getting the information that we hoped had already been published would be easier. There were some key takeaways that I'd like to share, as although we thought it would be much easier, there were a few things that kind of stopped it maybe being as easy or as quick as we thought. The first being that if the supplier had data in non-financial years, so they maybe did calendar years or some other timing, they had to modify it in order to fit their reporting cycle, which took some time. Also, suppliers that hadn't got any of the information, they needed support in order to find who they should be speaking to in order to get that raw data. So they both took time. And we do hope that, as we've kind of done this once, that it will get quicker going forward. And as we move away from the supplier base and get towards the more contract specific, it will get quicker too. Some other learnings were that I do think it was helpful that we had kind of started this conversation with suppliers before we got involved with Avarni, as it meant that they were kind of already used to having these sorts of questions around, like, what were they doing in the carbon space, or had they got carbon footprint, or where they were in the journey with Heart of the City. And then the other thing was, if they had got data in the financial year, it took suppliers less than half an hour to upload it, which was really good. We did also explain to the suppliers that just any data at this stage was better than no data. So they weren't being judged against anything. We just wanted to kind of start the process. And I will now go to the next slide to talk about results, which is probably why most of you are here. So we invited our 25 suppliers to the call, and 23 of them engaged with the process, which was great. 20 of those suppliers completed the questionnaire at some level, and 12 suppliers gave us enough information to confidently move them away from that spend-based proxy figure. To do this, we either needed to create kind of that supplier emissions factor, which for us meant having measured their own scope 1 and 2 and at least the purchased goods and services category of scope 3, or that they had data that specifically linked to the City of London contract. We did have a number of other suppliers that provided us with scope 1 and 2 and the 5 categories of scope 3 from the PPN 0621. But we just felt that because that excluded purchased goods and services, and because that's such a large part of an organization's emissions, as David explained earlier, we felt that excluding or using that would be underrepresenting the emissions that we had from our supply chain, and therefore our data would be artificially low. And although we obviously do want to see our carbon footprint reduce, at this stage, it's more important for us to be confident and transparent in our data and trying to tie that back to something at an organizational level that we kind of have a link with rather than DEFRA. And then we can kind of start honing in onto where, the higher parts are and what we can really do. DEFRA is really just there, I think, to help you point you in the right direction of where to start looking and which suppliers to maybe start your engagement process with. When we compared our new carbon footprint with if we had done nothing, i.e. we just kind of used the spend-based proxy methodology through the greenhouse gas protocol, we saw a drop of 12%. When we take this back to our baseline, we're down 7%. And those 12 suppliers that we were able to move away or get enough data from account for about £66 million of our spend through the supply chain. It is worth noting, though, that not every single supplier did show a decrease. A handful did increase their carbon emissions based on what their spend-based proxy methodology would show. And that's okay, because, if they are working on their own carbon reduction journey, or we're working with them at a contract level to reduce carbon, then we should see a reduction next year. Also, by moving away from the DEFRA emissions factors, we should hopefully start to decouple spend from carbon, at least slightly. I mean, we are kind of possibly too early in our journey to say or have proof of this, but in theory, if we spend more with supplier that is actively reducing their carbon and we're kind of buying the low carbon products or doing things in a more sustainable way, then even if we spend more with that supplier, in theory, the carbon shouldn't directly correlate to that, so it should go up more slowly. But time will tell on whether that hypothesis is correct. If we can move on, we'll look at some of the case studies or the suppliers that we worked with to show what some of those results looked like. If we can move on again, please. So I've pulled out an example from each of the categories, all of which were at different stages of their carbon reporting journey. And I kind of hope that this shows that no matter the size or where you are as an organization or the organization is in their journey, there is some level of opportunity. So Preventex is our sexual health testing contract, and its best aligned SIC codes are social community care supplies and services and basic pharmaceutical products and pharmaceutical preparations. Both of these have a very high carbon proxy emissions factor, and neither actually reflect the service that's kind of being provided through this contract. And that's why we can see such a big drop there. if anybody wants more information about these suppliers, I can put you in touch. Thames Reach are a charity, and they, with Avarni's help, created their very first carbon footprint for the first time, and that also saw a reduction. Dana, who do our stationery, have a very large supply chain, as you would imagine, and had already measured their scope 1 and 2, you know, looking at their own part. But through Avarni, they were able to upload their supply chain data and put kind of a carbon number against that. I mean, it is using proxy at that stage, but, you know, we're just slowly starting to move away from just not everything being proxy. And I think that kind of goes back to David's point around starting somewhere and not just trying to look for like the most perfect data. Like anything kind of is better than nothing. At least that's what we're hoping to convey or think. And then lastly, FM Conway, who do our highways maintenance, they were already reporting their kind of carbon emissions at a contract level. But if we hadn't been able to put that onto the tool, then it never would have been captured, so we couldn't report on it. So they'd be doing all this great work, and like locally, we'd know that they were making a difference, but externally, that couldn't be portrayed. And so hopefully that's helpful and interesting to you all. I would just like to say a really big thank you to all of the suppliers that we worked with last year, both those on the screens and the others, all 23 of them that were part of this process. And also obviously thank you to Avarni for also helping them go on this journey. And I look forward to starting it all again in a couple of months' time as the financial year starts to end. So that's it. I hope you've all found this useful, and we'll now hand back to Avarni for the question answer part of the session. And please do use the chat function if you do have one.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much, Kristina, for that walkthrough. I think definitely the key takeaways, and I think that we've discussed this off camera, is definitely just starting somewhere, I think, and that might be just starting to do that initial baseline and calculate and understand your emissions. But as we've done with these 25 suppliers, is just doing it at a small scale, taking these learnings that we have had from these suppliers, being really open to taking the feedback from the suppliers that we have worked to, and being able to build a model that we can scale across the broader supply chain. So I'm really excited about the next steps and the next steps that will come with this partnership that we do have at the City of London. Just got one question in the chat right now. So again, if anyone does have questions, please do drop them in. But the first question, I think we've spoke a bit to throughout this call, is what are the capabilities that we deliver to suppliers and to make it really easy for suppliers. So do you have any thoughts on that, Kristina, or I can speak to those as well? So I think for myself, I think throughout Avarni's journey, we've worked a lot with supply chains, and the key learnings that we've seen is that organizations lack capabilities. And when we see capabilities, that's in the form of knowledge. What is carbon? How do you create a baseline? Technology. How can we make this very challenging manual process something that is simple for an organization to complete? And of course, education, delivering simple messaging, delivering educational content. I think the Heart of the City is a really great example of what best practice for education and delivering of capabilities across the supply chain does look like. Those suppliers that went through the Heart of the City had great outcomes when it comes to this compartment of the program. So I think one of the key drivers of success is we've been able to deliver sort of Avarni's technology through to the supply chain and let them begin to calculate and manage their emissions, which has been a great driver of success there as well. Kristina, do you have anything to add on the back of that?
Yeah, thank you. I was put myself on mute because there was some drilling going on and then it couldn't get off. Yeah. So I think Avarni's solution is quite user-friendly. So they've really just broken it down into 4 main areas initially for suppliers to upload kind of en masse. So like just through an Excel spreadsheet. which I think really helps to take away some of the time. And then you can also input more local information. So waste, for example, isn't one of their like big four, but you can still put the information on there, and it is like all kind of online, so easier to access that way. And Avarni have been quite good at hand holding some of the suppliers through. So although there is the odd time zone difference, they have been readily available to help any supplier like upload the data or show them what to do.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Neil, to your question with regards to do City of London get a direct feed of the data from suppliers? And yes, that the answer to that is yes, is that suppliers, as I've noted, get this free instance of Avarni when they're invited by the City of London. So now they can calculate, manage their carbon emissions, and hopefully utilize the platform to set their own targets. But what this means from a emissions accounting perspective is that now the City of London and this supplier, or these many suppliers, do have a linkage, and that supply-based emissions factor will continue to update as the supplier does update their data on the platform. Next question we're looking here is, let me just read it. It's a little bit. If an organisation can provide IT that has net zero scope 1 and 2, and additionally helps to provide confident and transparent data to help calculate and reduce your carbon footprint when procuring laptops, devices, would you be open to considering them as a supplier? Russell, can you? Yeah.
Sorry. I was just going to say, as a starter, I mean, that's where we obviously want to get to. Like, the more carbon friendly or carbon reduced any supplier is, then we would like to see that supplier win. So, but it does have to be balanced with the other parts of the procurement process. So at the moment, for the city at least, it's split. So responsible procurement, so both environment and people, has 15% of the overall weighting, and then technology, or the technical side, and the price gets split for the remaining 85%. So there are questions that are built in and weighted to the supplier to hopefully give more chance of winning, I guess, those that are further forward on their journey, but also are willing to work with us. But it is still balanced against the actual technical capabilities of that and the price. We also work with suppliers to kind of help move towards that. So although, I mean, personally, carbon is very important to me, obviously the operations team do still have their operational requirements they want to get met. So part of what we're doing is trying to promote that suppliers that have these benefits are really good, and trying to get them into the supply chains to bid. But as a public kind of sector, we do have to follow those procurement regulations still. So yes, in theory, to, you know, open to everybody, but we can't guarantee the outcome.
And building on that question, are suppliers able to share data with regards to recycling, remarketing, redistribute, and how these carbon emissions are avoided because of these activities? And yes, business initiatives that organisations are taking within their own operations can be shared to the City of London and any other organisations. The questionnaire is completely customisable, so you can sort of ask more general question regarding sort of potentially what type of renewable energy activities or what are other sustainability programs that you might have in place as well. So we do want to make this as a really standard way and create transparency across the supply chain as much as possible. Margaret, yeah, thanks for the question regarding methodologies. Yes, Avarni, what we've done with the City of London, it did start with the spend-based methodology, or building on the great work that they've done historically to baseline their emissions. So we've initially done that spend-based methodology, and we're looking to evolve that into potentially utilising primary activity data or secondary activity data, I should say, as the next step. And then, of course, as we've been speaking to, shifting as much of those emissions calculations to supply-based emissions calculations as possible.
I think it's also possibly worth noticing that with the kind of spend methodology, we've also been trying not to use it just at the very high level of the supplier. We've been looking more at what they've actually been buying. So, you know, the type of products that comes in. So have they been buying wood or steel or plastic or whatnot? So it isn't kind of at that very high level. We are trying to go that one step lower on like what was actually on the PO, just to try and give us a tiny bit more accuracy within kind of the spend area, because like some of our contracts we don't necessarily use them for what their company is like known for. So we're potentially overinflating their carbon emissions because their organization can do maybe full facilities management, but we're actually using them for one part of that, like the least carbon intensive part sort of thing. So we're trying to look below that when we are using the spend base, but we do want to move to that supplier emissions factor and then move to the contract specific factor as we go. Just going to move on to Neil's next question about rewarding suppliers for their CO2 reductions. We're not really far enough forward in the journey for that. At the moment, we've very much just we've just got the information for year one. So next year we'll be able to see if any of those any reductions have been achieved from supplier to supplier, because I don't think it's I don't want to say fair, but like going from spend based to supplier isn't necessarily a reduction as such. It's improved accuracy, which helps to have a reduction. And as I said, sometimes they did go up. So I don't think you can kind of award or do anything at that level. But as we go forward and we have more accurate information and we're comparing kind of the apples with the apples at that point, then we could review. But also I think, we do have a target to get to, and those suppliers have a target to get to. So one could argue it's just kind of doing the right thing that they've actually set up to achieve anywhere as an organizational level. So yeah, I don't know. I guess is the answer is different ways to slice that one, but it's the short answer is right now we haven't done anything because it's just their support to get better data rather than an actual kind of like full reduction.
And Helen, with regards to your question on what is our overall success rate with our supplier engagement processes, I think we have seen similar success of what we have done with the City of London. So similar statistics with regards to questionnaire completions of, I think it was around 80%, and the number or the proportion of those suppliers that were able to move to a supplier-based emissions factor. So we've seen a lot of success in the same or what's the success of the City of London across a number of our other clients. How we have been able to do this is that we believe that, of course, vendor engagement, as I hope you've seen, or supplier engagement, is more than just sending out a simple questionnaire to a supplier and hoping that they complete it. We spend a lot of time in really planning out and building a program that fits with the organization and is really built on these core principles that we've spoken to. So it's really ensuring that we do have buy-in from procurement teams, having great advocates like Kristina to lead this piece of work with ourselves. So that's driven a lot of success. Embedding it into sort of the policies that we've spoke about, and embedding it into clear ways of communication, education, and capabilities to supply chain. So happy to have continue this conversation as well, Helen. Off call. Rob, thank you. Thanks for this information here. Definitely, we'll check that out. And I just one last question here is, yes, suppliers are able to share information with regards to avoided emissions and sort of how that plays into the initial organization's journey as well. So that's correct.
Yeah, and I think just again, I guess I build on that is the system can obviously put in different factors. So if we wanted to change it from X to Y because we had more information or we knew it was a different process, then we can put that against those lines so we can start seeing the differences. So yeah, hopefully that helps answer your question.
And suppliers can also upload their information to the platform to use the right factors that are consistent with what they're already doing. So, if you've already done it, you can always sanity check it as well using Avarni.
Okay, that's fine, Russell.
Yeah, would love to continue as many of these conversations offline and continue the discussion. But firstly, I think, yeah, of course, thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. I think this has been a really exciting conversation from my side, and I look forward to doing a couple more of these in the future. Us at Avarni and the City of London, of course, look forward to sort of sharing these practices. This will be sent out post, so you'll get a recording of this session. And do expect, I think Cornell will be looking to have a couple of conversations offline, and myself as well, on really understanding how your organizations are managing your emissions, and potentially how are you looking to engage and manage your supply chain emissions as well. So stay posted. Have a look, keep your inboxes open. So I appreciate that. Thank you for the time.
Yes, thank you everybody for joining. I hope you found it useful.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Have a great day.
Thank you all. Take care.